And I'm going to be talking on behalf of my colleagues today about a digital intervention that's actually specifically to support the new pharmacy-led services that have been introduced to manage common infections. So it's going to be split into 3 sections. We're going to start with the development of the intervention itself and details around that, the process and what it contains. Then we'll talk a bit about the feasibility trial, which is actually still ongoing, and I'm able to give you some early insights from the process evaluation. I should say that whilst I worked on the development and helped set up the feasibility trial, I actually moved on to a different project, but have stayed very much in touch with the group. So if there's questions around the feasibility and process evaluation, I may have to go and speak to my colleague who's running that and get back to you, but I will certainly do my best. As well as talking about those, what I wanted to do was also talk about the contextual challenges. So everyone who has run trials is very familiar with these, and there's certainly been a lot in this context, and I thought it might be quite interesting to run through those because it's something that everybody faces but often isn't talked about. So the background might be something that many of you are familiar with. So half of patients who visit their general practice with a common infection are likely to be prescribed antibiotics for it. But we also know that most antibiotics are unlikely to help. The infection is usually viral rather than bacterial. And of course, overuse of antibiotics is contributing to antimicrobial resistance. So the pharmacy-led services were launched in community pharmacies in England. They'd been happening in Scotland and Wales for some time before, with the aim of alleviating stress on practices and moving patients to have management of common infections at the pharmacist. And as part of that, pharmacists obviously decide the appropriate management plan and are able to supply antibiotics to patients with acute infections. So the aim of the phased-in study was we wanted to make sure that pharmacists were supported appropriately to treat these common infections. And then we also wanted to enable patients to be able to self-care for their infection, because we know that if they feel confident to do that, then they're more likely to accept not having antibiotics as part of their treatment. So we developed a digital intervention that was going to both support pharmacists in delivering the new services and also promote appropriate antibiotic prescribing. So more details on the intervention and what it contains. We called it the Common Infections Toolkit, or KIT for short. And the sections for pharmacists contained brief training, so sort of an overview on how to structure person-centered consultations. And then there's a diagnostic aid with different infections, and they're able to enter the symptoms in, and then they receive a treatment recommendation. And these have been based on nice guidelines, but also we've used recent evidence from cohort and RCT studies. And for those of you that are familiar with fever pain, this has been developed in a sort of similar algorithm, but extended out to a wider range of infections. And for the feasibility trial, we were also providing point of care tests to the pharmacies for cough, sinusitis, sore throat and UTI. So where the algorithms based on the symptoms suggest that there was uncertainty for those infections, they were able to carry out the point of care tests to try and eliminate that uncertainty. And then for the patients, we developed leaflets that contained appropriate information about antibiotic use, details on self-care and also safety netting. And these were based on the target leaflets. And so I'll be talking in more detail about that later on. So I should probably point out at this point that phased in is similar to, but slightly different in terms of the infections that it covers in comparison to pharmacy first. So those of you who are familiar with it will recognise most of these, so I'll just point out the differences. So we included lower respiratory tract infections, so coughs, and we didn't include shingles. So the intervention development was based around the person-based approach, and I will talk through this in more detail as I go through it, because some of you may have heard of it but not be that familiar with the components of it. So this is the wheel that we use, and we tend to use as much of it as possible, but I'm just going to be talking through particularly the sections that are appropriate. So PPI, and then having people who are obviously invested in the outcomes and the processes, are central to the person-based approach. And so we had a core team of PPI pharmacists, clinicians, NHS England and behavioural psychologists, and they all worked across the intervention development and also setting up the trial processes. In terms of user needs studies, we carried out semi-structured and think aloud interviews, which I'll be explaining what think aloud interviews are in a bit more detail in a few slides. We spoke with pharmacists, a few practice prescribers, members of the public, and we also did a brief survey with practice receptionists as well. And then the components of the PBA that we used throughout the development process were guiding principles, intervention planning table, and table of changes. So the guiding principles are about what the intervention needs to make it engaging. Intervention planning table is about a behavioural analysis, so putting together all the information we know, barriers and facilitators to behaviour change, and then identifying psychological theories that are likely to be relevant. And the table of changes is a way that we have of optimising interventions. So all of the feedback we have from our PPI group, from our core team, and from qualitative interviews is all put into the table of changes, sort of positive and negative comments, so that we can then decide which change is going to be appropriate and help the intervention be as effective as possible. So a bit more detail about who was involved. We had 7 PPI members, and we worked with them initially by talking to them about, and this was carried out prior to the launch of Pharmacy First. But we knew that it was coming, and the CPCS service was already there, but of course that didn't enable pharmacists to prescribe, well, to supply antibiotics as part of the service. So we explained what Pharmacy First would look like and spoke with our PPI to find out their attitudes around being referred to see a pharmacist and what they thought would be barriers and facilitators to that service. They worked with us on the patient leaflets. As I said, we adapted the target ones. And then as the process went on and we realised that patients were likely to be able to see kit during a consultation, we carried out mock consultations with them. I remember of our team acted as a pharmacist having a consultation and using a diagnostic aid, and then we could collect feedback from the PPI as to how that process felt for them and what they thought of the diagnostic aid and the impact that had on the consultation process. They also worked with us really closely throughout the design of the feasibility trial, which was really helpful, as you'll see when we get into more details about that later. There were loads of really important things that we had to consider about how close the pharmacy and the GP were, how willing people would be to travel, and then a level of detail that we'd never anticipated. So if we're going to do point of care tests, people needed to turn up with urine samples, and most pharmacies don't have toilets. So then we were asking them, would it be feasible for them to go to the practice first and use their toilet and then carry it down to the pharmacy, and all of those kind of things which are really important, and they actually were very helpful in going through all of those details with us. And then the team was made up of, as I said earlier, pharmacists, clinicians, NHS England, and behavioural psychologists, and we worked together throughout the whole process. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the qualitative data that we collected and give you some of an overview of the analysis we did on the pharmacists' data. So we carried out semi-structured and think aloud interviews. So think aloud interviews are literally what they say. So the semi-structured bit is where we ask questions about different aspects of their role and things like that, which I'll talk about in more detail in a minute. Whereas the think aloud, we allow them to have access to the intervention and to work through it and give us feedback on that. Now, we spoke to 22 pharmacists. I should say that because this was prior to the Pharmacy First launch, we actually spoke to 19 initially, and then once Pharmacy First had launched, we spoke to a further 3 just to get their perceptions of how it was working and potentially changing practice. We spoke to 16 members of the public. Again, we did semi-structured to talk to them about their experiences of having antibiotics or wanting antibiotics for a common infection, either for themselves or for a child that they care for. And we then also showed them the leaflets and got them to feedback on their thoughts on that. The practice prescribers, we only spoke to 3, and that was really just to get an overview of how they felt the trial was set up and whether they felt that kit was acceptable, because confidence from GPs in the system that pharmacists is using is really important to support that referral. And then the open response surveys with practice receptionists was again just to check that we'd set up their part of the intervention okay, so that, I mean, we weren't expecting any behaviour change from them. We were hoping to align with the processes that they were already using, and to record data about how people were coming to them, whether they were happy to be referred, what were the reasons that they might not, and we hoped that would support the referral process. And all of these were recruited through social media and clinical networks. So I'm just going to run through quickly. I've talked a bit about the methods, but in a bit more detail. So as I said, in terms of the sort of semi-structured part, we were talking to them, to the pharmacists, about implementing the new pharmacy-led services. So we made sure that we spoke to people who were already delivering CPCS, who were also interested in potentially delivering Pharmacy First when that was going to be launched. We talked to them about their role in terms of antimicrobial stewardship, and then how they thought a behavioural intervention might support them. And then, as I mentioned, we actually got them to feedback on the intervention, their thoughts around that, so that we could optimise it and change it. So with the data, and it was mainly the semi-structured data, we, from the semi-structured part of the interview, we carried out a thematic template analysis using the COM-B model. And I'm going to run through some of the results from that now based around the COM-B model. And if you're not familiar with it, hopefully this will become apparent as we talk through them. So psychological capability is one of the components. So that's about feeling that they're going to be capable in terms of the skills that they have in order to use the intervention, deliver the service, etc. So what we found is that they felt they were likely to use KIT because it provided a set structure that would deliver comprehensive consultations. So I've got a quote here: "It," meaning KIT, "gives you a clear way to obviously structure your consultation. I think for myself that would be really useful because I don't do consultations all of the time. So good to have that guide and prompt of things to ask and how to structure it better." Social opportunity was around interactions with the sort of the pharmacist social network. And we had mixed array of feedback on that. So one of the things that came across from the pharmacists is they were concerned around how patients may perceive them and therefore perceive the service they're offering. And wonderful quote from one of our interviewees here: doctors are still the gods. So if the receptionist calls you to say the pharmacist will call you, that means they are going to get a second-class treatment. Then we also talked about the opportunity for the new services to potentially reduce antibiotics, but also patient expectations for them, and doing that through increased confidence and awareness of antimicrobial resistance. So many pharmacists were already having those conversations with their patients, but they felt that the way that Kit structured that and gave information would help support some of those conversations. And again, having Kit on the screen in the consultation room, they felt would involve them in the decision-making process. They also felt that the leaflets were likely to reinforce self-care because of the details that were on them. But also, some of the pharmacists said that if you've got a patient who's coming expecting something and you're telling them that they're not going to get antibiotics, then sometimes giving them a leaflet still makes them feel like you've taken their concerns seriously and that you're still giving them something that will be useful to them. Physical opportunity. So these are around the actual physical environment. And what we found is that pharmacists felt that the service that they were offering and could offer through Pharmacy First would actually be really helpful for patients. Obviously, as we know, there's a lot of patients who wait for appointments to practices. It can often be quite a time lengthy process even to get through to them. And so the ease and accessibility of pharmacists was perceived as being really helpful to patients. So a quote here talking about the people who lived near to them. They don't have ways of getting places on the weekend and stuff. So yes, it would be good if I could just help them and give them it straight away. It would be really useful. So this is about obviously pharmacies potentially being based in certain communities and also being open in the evenings and weekends and not necessarily needing to have an appointment in order to access them. So there was a mixed opinion in terms of the reimbursement. So Pharmacy First is paying pharmacies based on the number of patients they see through the service. And so people we spoke to who were owners of independent pharmacies obviously found that really motivating. And some of them said that actually they couldn't keep the business going without taking on these extra services because of the costs. But when we spoke to employees, for example, one person worked in a pharmacy in a very large Tesco's. They weren't going to see any of that reimbursement, so it wasn't an incentive for them. What came up repeatedly were concerns around coordinating service delivery with GPs. So this could be around the communication with them, setting up appointments, patient information. And there's a quote here: through the triage, the receptionists we found with Pharmacy First are only led by what the patient says. They don't necessarily look beyond what's said. So we've had people come through Pharmacy First that are just not what the receptionist was told or thought they were told. And so I'd ask you to just keep this in the back of your mind for when we get to the process evaluation, because it will be echoed there. So reflective motivation, what we found from the pharmacists is that they felt that using KIT would increase their confidence and that they found it easy to use and to integrate into their current practices. So a couple of quotes here. I think using a decision aid gives you a lot of confidence, which is the main thing, because if you aren't confident, then your patient is not confident. Then that just makes the whole thing a bit awkward and silly. It makes sure you're following each step, following it in the right sequence, and then you're getting to an outcome at the end. People are going to be treated correctly and get the right advice and treatment that they need. What we also found is that pharmacists were very motivated by their professional identity and saw these new services as something that they really wanted to deliver successfully, and they were really appreciative of the opportunity to expand their role and take on this and offer a service that would help people. One quote here from someone who was already starting to deliver Pharmacy First, so one of those later interviews. As I said, I believe it's really exciting times. We're on the cusp of something really, really good. Pharmacy First is already starting to show some real positives. So I'm going to talk a bit now about, so if you can remember back to the PBA wheel, the bottom half of that. So some of the techniques that we use as part of the person-based approach when we're designing interventions. So I'm going to be talking through the guiding principles, not so much the psychological theories that were involved, but we're then going to look at some of the comments on the table of changes, and then what changes that led to within the intervention. So starting first with the pharmacist section, so that's the consultation training and the diagnostic aid. So as I said earlier, the guiding principles are around making the intervention as engaging, relevant and persuasive as possible. And so the user context will come both from the qualitative interviews and also from our PPI. So the pharmacists, what we found was they were lacking in confidence in structuring and delivering person-centered consultations. And you could see that from some of the quotes that we had earlier. So when we designed it, one of our objectives was to really clearly explain how a person-centered consultation works, what it would look like, and how to use kit within that. And we commissioned 3 animated videos to be created, which demonstrated a consultation using the interventions so that it gave a really clear example of how to incorporate them. There were concerns that the intervention would be difficult or time consuming to use. When we first started showing people the training section, there was sort of a bit of technophobia, I think, going on, where people were thinking, oh God, it's another sort of online app that we're going to have to familiarise ourselves with, and it's going to be complicated. So we wanted to make sure that we were going to be able to reassure pharmacists that the intervention would actually save them some time and would be easy to use. And so within the intervention, in the training section, we put in visual explanations and examples of the diagnostic aid so that people could see really quickly that actually it was really, really simple. And then once they got through to the diagnostic aid and started playing around with it, they saw that actually there wasn't a huge amount of data collection. It was based around symptoms, and that all of the information was on one page. They didn't need to go clicking around to find it. So one of the user contexts was concerns about identifying seriously ill patients. Now, I have to say these concerns were actually raised by the core team. The pharmacists that I spoke to were very competent and believed that they were already able to do that. But it's obviously quite a serious concern, and when you're only speaking to 22 people, you need to make sure that you're covering it for everybody. And ensuring appropriate safety netting was considered to be a really important objective. And so we added an initial assessment before accessing the diagnostic aid, and you can see it here. So we just asked them to enter age, pulse, SATs and temperature for each patient. And if they were okay, then they got this message saying you can now go ahead and use the diagnostic aid. And if, however, they weren't and they were showing signs of serious illness, then that would actually say, you need to refer them on to an appropriate service. And so we put this in during the optimization process, and despite most pharmacists that we spoke to feeling that they were able to safety net sufficiently, they still all felt that this was a really a good practice for them to have, and that it reassured them. So moving on to the table of changes, as I said, that's about the feedback that we get from the core team and from the people from the qualitative interviews that we're doing and the think aloud sections of those. And it's a way of recording feedback and then deciding what changes to make. So, for example, some of the issues actually feed into each other in terms of making a change to address more than one issue at a time. So a couple of issues here. Layout of the recommendations was difficult to follow and time consuming to read. And this is where we realised as well that there was potential for patients to be able to see kit when they were in a consultation. And so it needed to be that it was easy for the pharmacist to use and also something that a patient could look at and understand as well. So we changed the format, as you can see on this screen, to make it sort of very clear steps so that it was quick and easy to follow. Pharmacists also were saying that through CPCS and then Pharmacy First, once it had launched, that they really struggled in being able to give the appropriate amount of detail to practices. That might have changed because obviously the service has been in for a bit longer, but when Pharmacy First came in, it was literally just NHS emails sending information back. So we added a cut and paste facility so that the symptoms that they'd entered into kit would literally just be collected, and then they could paste that into an email to send to the practice. So moving on now to the patient leaflet. So this is obviously a different perspective because it's something that we're looking for the patients to use and to support them in kind of adhering to the treatment process. So it was really important, again, that the leaflets were engaging, relevant and persuasive. So user context concerns that messages for worsening symptoms cause anxiety, and this was actually really strong. This came particularly from our PPI group, and some of them actually wanted the safety netting section removed. But of course, it's really important and it does need to be there. So we set an objective that we wanted to find a way to include that information, but do it in a way that didn't increase anxiety and was potentially reassuring to patients. So after talking with them quite a bit, what we came up with was putting it into a 3-step process. And so they'd look through step 1 first, which was about their treatment plan. Step 2 was about self-management. And then step 3 was what to do if symptoms got worse or didn't improve. And that was at the end, and it was very clearly marked. So for those who were feeling anxiety but didn't actually feel their symptoms had worsened, they knew that it was there and they could go back and look at it and find it quite easily. What we also found, both from the interviews and from our PPI group, is that patients wanted really detailed self-care information, and they also wanted specific details for children. So we'd started by just doing them generically by condition. But of course, the self-care advice for children can be quite different. So one of the objectives became to provide personalised information that would be able to support adherence to the management decision, which is what we were hoping good quality self-care information would do. And for that purpose, we created individual leaflets. I think we ended up with over 100 in the end, because we did them for adults and for children, for every single infection and for all 3 potential outcomes. So whether they'd been given antibiotics, whether they were going to have delayed antibiotics or no antibiotics at all. And you can see here this stepped process. So your treatment plan, how to help yourself get better, and then in case your symptoms change and get worse. So some of the issues in terms of how we logged potential changes and made decisions on them. So one of the issues that came up from talking with members of the public and our PPI group was confusion and lack of understanding around antimicrobial resistance. And so the wording that we'd put in initially, we also shared the leaflets with the pharmacists, and some of the pharmacists said, actually, this needs to be less sort of strongly worded, because I might need to give these people antibiotics, and when you're talking about the side effects and them being unpleasant, what happens if a patient that I've told, you know, taking antibiotics might not be great for you, comes back and I want them to take antibiotics because it's appropriate for their condition. So what we did was we created plain English explanations about what antimicrobial resistance was, and we changed the language to make sure that whilst it was persuasive, it wouldn't deter them from taking antibiotics in the future. We also had feedback from when we developed the children's leaflets that the safety netting information was massively overwhelming for parents who were concerned about their children. And so we took from the traffic light system, which I think is already very well known, and we adapted that and put that on the leaflets for them. Right, so I'm going to move on to the feasibility trial plan. So this is very much the plan, and then we will get to what actually happened. So what we decided to do was create clusters. So these were going to be a practice and a community pharmacy that were relatively local to each other that would then work together. So the practice would refer patients who were willing to take part in the study directly to the community pharmacy within their cluster. So we wanted to recruit 20 in total, and then this is a very simplified version of the trial, but hopefully it's the easiest way of doing it. So at baseline, everyone would complete consultation details from 10 patients, and that might be the practice who was doing it or the pharmacy who was doing it. It could be a mixture of both. Then those clusters would be randomized into an intervention group and a control group. There would be about 4 weeks of the trial period during which the intervention group would use kit in consultations, and that was the pharmacies. The practices did have access to it, but it was optional as to whether they wanted to use it or not. And then for the control group, no action was required. It was just usual care. Then we carried out an audit period, which was essentially a sort of replication of baseline, obviously, so we could compare differences. And the intervention group, both the pharmacies and the practices, were asked to use kit in consultations, and the control group would just be doing their consultation details. And then obviously the aim from that was to compare the differences in antibiotics that were supplied. And then after the audit period, the trial period for the intervention group continued as before. So now we get into the contextual challenges. So we were funded with the impression that we would be working with Pharmacy First, which was going to be launched sort of in the future, maybe 1 to 2 years. We'd have the opportunity to work with them to ensure that phased in was compatible with the service. But it was actually rolled out at great speed in January 2024. They used PGD's, patient group directions, so that pharmacists were able to supply antibiotics. And as I mentioned earlier, phased in actually includes coughs, which meant that to supply antibiotics for that, there would need to be a separate PGD. And whilst that might sound easy, it's actually quite complicated because it's all around governance. And NHS England were under huge pressure to roll out Pharmacy First. And they just said to us, look, the time it would take us to set up the governance and include this, we just don't have, because we're so focused on getting this done. So the suggestion was made that we moved over to working with the Independent Prescribers Pathfinders programme, or Pathfinders as we just called it for simplicity. So a bit more about that. NHS England had recruited 200 pharmacies who already had qualified independent prescribers working with them. The service was due to start in spring 2024. I have to say, NHS England were fantastic. The people that we were working with on Pathfinders were really, really supportive, really keen to work with us. And of course, we had that bit more time to align the trial with the services. We also felt it would be future-proofing by working with this group of prescribers, because from 2026, undergraduates will be leaving as qualified prescribers. And actually, when we looked back at the data, because we suddenly thought, is this a different group of people? Is our intervention designed for them? We'd actually already interviewed 68% of our sample who were independent prescribers. But we did go back and do these extra 3, and we still had really positive feedback on kit from them. But Pathfinders didn't run smoothly either, so it was anticipated to be signed off in March 2024. And then the general election was announced and everything got frozen, and it wasn't actually signed off until the September. Although they had 200 community pharmacies with them, although it was directly commissioned from NHS England, obviously with the ICBs, because there was a range of services, not just common infections, they were sort of commissioning which services would be run, and so there was a fair bit of confusion around whether they were able to take part in phased in or not. And then the online system Clio that had been designed to support Pathfinders was actually delayed in the rollout. So some of the pharmacies that were coming on it became a stepped process rather than everybody being able to start when it launched. So what that meant for phased in is that although we'd had 200 pharmacies that we could approach, it was apparent that we weren't, under the way that we were doing the clusters, we weren't going to get the number that we needed. So we needed to look outside of the Pathfinders and get clusters where the practice would agree to write prescriptions on behalf of the pharmacy. Which meant they had to have a good working relationship and a lot of trust. And understandably, some practices said, I'm not happy doing that. I need to see my patients before I'll prescribe. There is low research experience in pharmacies, and so we would find practices that were willing to take part. We couldn't pair them with a cluster pharmacy and vice versa. Some of the clusters that we had, they were quite far apart, so we think that's then led to people being reluctant to go to another pharmacy that might not be their usual one. And most pharmacies who were interested in taking part were already offering pharmacy first, and would have to find a way, because we weren't part of pharmacy first, it had to be separate to that. So they could either choose to deliver both services or just phased in. So it actually started in March 2025, which was over a year later. We only had 16 clusters, so we had 10 Pathfinders and 10 using the GP prescribing route. And we ended up, rather than randomising 1-to-1, we had 11 in the intervention group and 5 in the control group. So we are carrying out a mixed methods process evaluation. The plan was to carry out qualitative interviews with people in the intervention group, because we already have a fair idea of what usual care looks like. So we're speaking to pharmacists, GPs, patients and receptionists, and we developed the interview schedules, so the subjects that we'll be talking to them around, based on trying to identify behaviour change mechanisms and an understanding of how the intervention might have worked. And then we also have the usage data from KIT that we could look at as well. So I'm starting to run over on time a little bit, but I'm nearly there. So some early insights. The practices, well, they're not triaging. They're not referring patients to the pharmacies, which means the pharmacies are receiving really low numbers. Speaking to the receptionists, they've been saying to us that they're having real difficulties in the relationship between practices and pharmacies. They've been referring patients who have actually then been excluded and sent back, and the patient, by the time they get back to the practice, is pretty angry, and so the receptionists then have to deal with them. And so this was the one I was saying, you know, think back to the qualitative data and people saying that these were the kind of issues that people sending the wrong type of patients. And then, of course, there's also issues because people have loyalties to pharmacies, and so they're saying, no, I don't want to go to the one that's in your cluster, I want to go to my usual one. However, the receptionists were really positive about KIT. They said they actually preferred it to the farm refer system, found it easier to use and would like to have it long term. But a few of them are actually using it, and we suspect the reason for that is from the 11 practices in the intervention group, only one person has actually logged in and done the training. None of the prescribers are using KIT, even though part of the trial is that they get paid per patient. And so this has meant that all the responsibility for the baseline and audit consultation details has fallen onto the pharmacists, who aren't actually getting referred many patients. And we haven't been able to interview any of the practice prescribers yet, and we suspect it's because it's often an unpleasant conversation to say why you haven't done what you said you were going to do. So we're changing our approach to them at the moment, and we're sort of saying to them, we understand that you've had issues around this, and we'd really like to talk with you more and find out what we can do to help with that. In terms of the pharmacists, they have been using KIT. Yes, completing the consultation forms did take a bit of extra time, but actually they felt that using KIT produced better outcomes, so they're happy with that. It has been problematic. There's too many different systems. They've got Farm Outcomes, Consult, Smart, Pathfinder Portal, and Clio, and now KIT as well, and it's just too much. There's also pressures that they need to meet pharmacy first targets, and because of the low numbers of referrals, that's quite difficult. They do feel that using KIT has helped with decision making, and they do feel that they've followed the recommendations. They also liked having the point of care tests, although there seems to be a bit of a lack of trust in the strep test. And so as a result, they would prescribe because they weren't quite sure around it. Also, coughs in older patients was seen as higher risk, and so there's been increased prescribing around that. Now, we have had 2 accounts which are anecdotal and may not come through into the main data around conflict of interest. So, of course, pharmacies are commercial organisations, and patient satisfaction is what gets them to return. And patient satisfaction might mean prescribing antibiotics. So that's something that we're trying to find out a bit more about. We've had problems recruiting patients. I think the pharmacists didn't fully understand in the consent process what the process evaluation was. So we're having problems reaching them. And then some of them hadn't actually been made aware that KIT was available in the consultation, so they weren't able to comment on that process. And quite a lot of the ones that we have spoken to didn't receive the leaflets. So that's making it a bit more problematic. However, the good news is that the data from KIT shows a signal for lowered antibiotic supply by the intervention group compared to the control. And that is varying by condition, which is something we need to look into a bit more. So the conclusions, well, KIT does show promise at pharmacy level based on the data that we have so far. The trial is now being extended by 6 months, and we're just going to use the Pathfinder pharmacies and try and gain more patients through them. And we're also going to include walk-ins, so they no longer have to have been referred by the practice. So in terms of taking this through to a main trial, I think removing clustering is an absolute necessity. We feel that the training section needs to be improved for some of the processes so that the trial procedures are clearer for the pharmacists. We'd love to have full integration with the current pharmacy systems. I don't think that's likely, but we can always live in hope. What would also be wonderful is stability in the service. So the Pathfinders, the 200s that have been recruited, is an initial phase, and then they're wanting to roll that out further. So we'd either like to continue working with them, or actually, now that things have calmed with Pharmacy First, perhaps we can go back and talk to them about getting this additional PGD. And then I should also mention that we are in the process of developing a version for practices to use of KIT as well. That's it. Sorry, I've gone 7 minutes over. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much,
my
Sasha.
microphone.
Yeah, go on.
Yes, apologies, my microphone stopped working at the critical point. Thank you so much, Sasha. It's really interesting and also a good salutary tale for all of us trying to do complicated research in complicated settings, and how you have to adjust and change and modify constantly to try and get to the end. Does anyone have any questions for Sasha? Okay, well, I'll kick us off. I was interested in the comment about reimbursement, and how in some cases the pharmacist getting involved was the person who would see reimbursement from Pharmacy First and from other related systems, and in other cases it was just going to some man in the back, and you never really got it. Did you see that particularly amongst the practices where you were trying your intervention? And do you think that we should be reimbursing more or reimbursing differently for stewardship rather than just doing the thing?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, as I say, the one person who was very dismissive of it was someone who worked in Tesco's, in a pharmacy in Tesco's. And so for most of them, I mean, even unless they were locums who were moving around, who don't necessarily have a sense of loyalty, even the pharmacists who are working in independence still had, you know, as I talked about, sort of the motivation about professional identity. And that did come across really strongly. And so I think it was an understanding that the service was a really good thing, and that whilst they might not actually see any of that reimbursement, it was something that the pharmacy itself would benefit from, and therefore that would be a benefit to them. But, you know, it's very much, there were no pharmacists saying, oh yeah, I'm sat around all day doing nothing, I'm ready to take in, you know, consultations. What they were all saying is, I don't really know how I'm going to fit this in because I'm already really busy. So it was getting that balance.
You've got a question in the chat about how much the prescribers were paid per patient to do this work.
I didn't put that in because I have to be completely honest and say I stayed well away from that. So we had two parts to the trial. We had the trial team who did all of the kind of nuts and bolts of it, and then mine was more around intervention development and the feasibility process evaluation. So I can't actually answer that, I'm afraid. I know that we made it in line with what Pathfinders were paying.
Okay, thank you. So Sarah's got a question, and then Colin.
Thank you, Sasha. That was a great talk, and as Gail says, it's a really difficult study to do in a challenging setting. So it's impressive that it did get done. You said something right at the end. I might have missed it, but it was about healthcare professionals not having trust in Strep A tests. So can
Yes.
you say something? They were happy with the CRP, but they didn't like Strep A. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't, because I'm not on it anymore. I haven't seen all of the data, and we're at such an early stage. And so I don't know yet. Once we get to the analysis, I think there'll be more details. That was just sort of the first side of it. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to find out, particularly with the other tests as well, what people's perceptions were. No doubt we'll be sharing those with you anyway, Sarah.
Okay, Colin.
Yeah, I mean, it was really great. Did you get a sense of, you know, the safety netting? Any concerns of, you know, people maybe feeling outside of their competence, and, you know, if they were faced with someone that otherwise might have been seen, you know, somewhere where there's a more immediate kind of referral mechanism?
Yeah, so as I say, we're during the qualitative interviews, because about, you know, almost 70% were actually qualified independent prescribers. They all felt really confident around the safety netting. And in actual fact, so I think part of the issues that we had were that the receptionist or whoever was triaging at the practice was sending over people who should have been excluded both from the trial and from Pharmacy First. And the pharmacist was the one picking that up and saying, actually, this person's not eligible because they've got a comorbidity or whatever else, and then sending the patient back, which not great for patients being enamoured with the service, unfortunately. But no, interestingly, all the concerns around safety netting weren't raised by pharmacists. They were raised by other clinicians outside of pharmacy, whereas the pharmacists themselves all seemed to be quite confident around safety netting.
Manzi?
Thank you very much, Sasha. That was a really insightful and excellent presentation. I've got two questions, actually. One building on the safety netting comment, and that's around your description earlier about how it was the patient reps that were really against having that information in the patient leaflets, and they almost wanted to take it out. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of surprising. They felt that it increased anxiety because it was saying all of the symptoms that you might have. And, you know, you never know, because it was predominantly PPI who were giving this feedback. And of course, there's going to be selection bias of people who want to take part in these studies. And when you're advertising about something for common infections, you're potentially people who have greater concerns about having common infections. And some of them are first-time parents, anxiety around their child being ill. So yeah, there was actually a sort of strong push of, and that's why we came up with a compromise that they were happy with. But we said to them, yeah, we do need to have this in, because of course it's information on sepsis and when to call 999 and things like that. So it had to be in there.
Thank you. And then my second question is about the prescribing rates that you mentioned. I think you said some sort of signal that in the intervention group, prescribing rates of antibiotics were lower for certain conditions. Which conditions were associated with a lower antibiotic supply?
So because we haven't finished the trial, I've been asked not to actually give specific details on it because it might change.
Okay.
And so it's not a case of some of them are showing change and some of them are actually looking worse. Generally, it's a good story across the board, but some conditions seem to be showing more effect than others. But yeah, sorry, we'll have to wait until the trial's actually finished before we can talk about that in more detail, because these are literally insights rather than, you know, what we would class as results at this point.
Okay, any other questions? I was interested that you said that you reworked the explanation of antimicrobial resistance at the start to be more plain language, and that feels to me like a very overdue requirement, something that might take several years to really achieve for the UK general public. What did you come up with? What was your
grief, it's been a long time since I've done it, and I would say I still don't think it's perfect. I think there's probably still room for improvement, and of course it's that real balance between brevity and explanation, because actually it is quite a complicated concept. And we had to realize that when we were doing the leaflets, we were potentially communicating with someone who was like, I want antibiotics, why aren't I getting them? And we're not sure how much of a motivation something that feels kind of elusive like antimicrobial resistance might be. So we did say, if you use these when you shouldn't do, then they may stop working in the future when you really need them. That's kind of me paraphrasing then exactly what we put. And we also sort of explained about antimicrobial resistance, meaning that antibiotics stop working. and not just for you, but also for your family, because what we know is that, you know, protection around family can actually be stronger than for yourself sometimes. So, I mean, I could get the exact phrase and send it to you, but I would still feel that that would need to be adapted for each project that it was being used for, because you've got to think about the person who's reading its mindset at the time.
Sure. Great. Well, I think it looks like you've exhausted all of our questions for now, but I'm sure that you'd be willing to have further conversation.
I think Sarah's just put a comment in. Other people may find safety netting in, but yeah. Yes. Do you know what, Sarah? I agree with that completely. We often get, and it's the same with qualitative interviews, isn't it? People often tell you what they think other people would respond to it, and it's like, well, okay, but that's great. What do you think? No, I don't know if we've got a particularly anxious sample, but it was people who were actually saying, when I read this, it makes me feel nervous. So.
Yeah, makes me feel nervous too when I read it as a GP and think what I've missed. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for coming and joining us, Sasha, and thank you to everyone who's come for the webinar. It's great to see strong attendance for important topics like this. We have got future webinars coming up. Chika, do you want to tell us the date of the next one?
Yes, the next webinar is on 14th of October at 2 in the afternoon. So we look forward to having more people join. And thank you so much, Sasha, for your time today.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Sasha.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.